you've been a pioneer in many ways with respect to what's called harm reduction. Now, I'm again newer to this space and knew the phrase and knew the term for the last few years, but as I'm out speaking to dozens of people in my work, it's still a phrase that many people are either completely unaware of, or in some cases, I think mildly to maybe severely misguided on. And so I want to talk about harm reduction with you for a moment and ask you simply to tell me what it is.
Sure. So harm reduction is both a set of tools and an approach, a philosophical approach to people who use drugs. The set of tools that are available for harm reduction include syringe services programs where you can get a sterile syringe and that reduces the rate of HIV and Hep C. So the reason why, especially now that we have, we've come down a little bit in overdose deaths, but with this historic rates of overdose death, that's why harm reduction has become even more important. Because you can't expect everyone who is at risk for an overdose to just wake up one day and say, oh, I'm going to get treatment, even if it's available, even if they can find the right type of treatment. So we need to make sure they're getting the tools that they need, so they're reducing the harms that are associated with substance use. And harm reduction has been part of the public health community for a long time. And so think about, when you have put a seatbelt on, when you wear a helmet on your bike, those are harm reduction tools. And we would love everyone to drive safely. We would love for accidents never to happen. We would love for people not to speed, but they do. And so we need to reduce the harms that are associated with that. Now, I'm not equating, the use of injection drugs with speeding, but harm reduction is a public health tool that it shouldn't be politicized, but it's become political. And because it seems counterintuitive to people that you're giving someone the tools by which they could be harming themselves.
Right.
And think about, it's giving them something that will protect them from harms. And then the philosophical approach goes back to that stigma. The philosophical approach of harm reduction is accepting people who use drugs as human beings who are deserving of our help. And harm reduction is about meeting people where they are, but not leaving them there. Mm-hmm. So it's important that we not, be too political about it, but it obviously has become very politicized.
I have so many thoughts. One is, it just seems like there's a logical sequence, because if one can't get past this idea that substance use disorder is a condition, that's going to affect their view of harm reduction. Mm-hmm. It seems. What's the major pushback? Because from what I know about harm reduction, what I haven't seen, maybe I've seen it in some certain towns and states on this part of the country, if you will, but there doesn't seem to be this kind of wanton view of let's just give these people all that they need so that they could be as high as they want and die. But that's kind of some of the tropes or canards that you hear out there. Mm-hmm. It's just this very radical view of just letting people use with no intervention or no tools inside. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah, use without consequences, because the consequence itself, the thinking is the consequence itself is going to get that person to not use anymore. But the consequence itself, if you think about what we talked about initially, it's the definition of addiction is the use of a substance regardless of the consequences. So I'll give you a good example, naloxone. So naloxone is the drug that reverses an overdose. It's a miracle drug. Mm-hmm. And
with fentanyl, right?
With fentanyl, yes, heroin, opioids generally. So when I first started working in this, there were many people who really opposed the having broad access to naloxone
What?
for a number of reasons.
Okay, I'm so ready for them.
Well, one reason was that people needed to have that consequence,
Oh, wow.
and that would shake them up so that they would go get treatment. They had to hit rock bottom. But rock bottom, when you're using fentanyl, typically is death. And so that's why when we see the numbers come down in naloxone for overdoses, there hasn't been enough research to see exactly what the reasons are, but we have a lot more availability of naloxone today than we did 10 years ago. And one of the reasons is because we made a real effort when I was in the Obama administration. We made a real effort to get naloxone in the hands of people who would use it, but also we started with law enforcement because we knew in many areas law enforcement could be an important conduit for assistance if they were the first ones to show up in a rural area, but also it would help reduce the stigma of naloxone if you had law enforcement carrying it.
Sure.
And so now, obviously, we need much broader access to naloxone than we currently have. Much more, easier ways to get it. You can now get it over the counter, but it's still $45 over the counter, and it's locked up in some cases. But naloxone is a really good example of a tool that we had to get over that stigma about harm reduction in order to expand it.
It's fascinating. I came into this space, and I've told you this before. I mean, I stumbled into this when I was on a writing retreat in northern New Mexico, and there's a town that I would drive through that I didn't know at the time, but has a long history of uh, opioid addiction, going back to 2008 when the New York Times did a feature article on this, and last year the LA Times did. And I started wanting to learn more, and I started volunteering at a shelter. And it was really fascinating for me, Regina, having not worked in the field, if you will, to just speak to those using. Now, these are men and women who would go to the shelter for food and to spend the night. Many times they would choose to sleep in single digit weather as opposed to sleeping the night there and having to not use. That's a whole other topic. But the way they would describe fentanyl, and these were former heroin addicts, so they like the opioid high, which is a total relief of physical and emotional pain, which is why people like this stuff. But they would be told about the high risk involved in continuing. They smoke it. A lot of people smoke it, as you know. Uh, and I was speaking to someone yesterday who worked at the shelter, and I hadn't spoken with her in 6 months or so. And she was telling me about a lot of her friends that use fentanyl. And she said it's just so cunning. And now this is kind of addiction talk right now, but
Mm-hmm.
she said it's so cunning because she said every one of them will say, they won't say fentanyl. They'll say, yeah, I'm using blues, but I totally regulate. And it's, with 70,000 people dying a year, the majority of those, of course, are people that we know are using. Again, just to underscore your point, which is that's the definition. And despite the high risk of fatalities,
Mm-hmm.
and they've all had people that have known people that have died, there still is this continuation.
Mm-hmm.
It's insane.
Yeah.
Okay, so harm reduction is taking this idea that uh, there's a disorder called substance use disorder. It's not as simple as just simply kicking a habit or just saying no once and forever. And so, given that person P is going to be using it, we don't want that person to die in the same way that we don't want people driving to die if they're going to be driving anyway.